Okay, my clock marks 7 p.m. and we have about 30 people here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome. Today's webinar is Transitioning Your Farm into the Future. Your speakers today will be myself. Briefly, I'm just hosting the senior members of the team here. My name is Florencia Colella, and I have Stan Moore and Roger Betts here. We are farm business management educators with Michigan State University. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am multiracial. Stan and Roger, would you like to introduce yourselves in just a few words?
Sure. I'm Roger Betts, and I work in farm business succession and estate planning activities across the state, primarily in southern Michigan. I've been with Extension for over 40 years and enjoy this kind of work. I farm a little bit myself, and so I work a lot with different families in these transition issues.
My name is Stan Moore. I'm a farm business management educator up in northern part of Michigan, northern Lower Peninsula, and cover also the eastern U. Do a lot in the business management area as well as some labor management areas across the state.
Thank you. Okay. So before we start, I would like to show you our civil rights slide here and also acknowledge that MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ordabwa, and Potawatomi peoples that was seated in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw.
So, Florencia, we have why do we want to develop a business succession plan? Can't the kids just figure it out?
Yeah, Roger. Actually, they can, but a succession plan takes time, just like the farm does. If you choose not to spend time on your succession plan now, they will have to spend their time later, and the farm will suffer. Besides, doing it while you are still around gives you a degree of control that may make more sense that you exercise rather than them. For example, if you are the best person to decide on sibling issues and how to be treated as you get older and become unable to decide. On another hand, a slow succession will always have a lower financial impact on the business. We'll see more about that later. So you want to give yourself some time.
So why is this so difficult? Other people don't seem to have problems. Why is the farm so different?
Well, farms carry strong emotional value to family members, those family members involved in the farm, and those who just happen to spend time there occasionally. That can bring up lots of issues that need to be taken care of. Farms are harder to split than smaller estates or estates comprised of assets that may not need to continue to work as a whole like a farm does. So it is pretty difficult. That's why we're here today.
So we talk about things and we want to have a perfect plan. How do you make a perfect plan?
You don't, Roger. Nothing is ever perfect, but anything is better than nothing. We need to understand, and if there's one thing I would like attendees to take home today, is that small steps make all the difference, although it may not seem like. Another really important thing for accomplishing a good transition plan is to put things in writing. Let it first be notes that are shared, reviewed, and discussed among those involved. Then try to convert those notes into actionable items and convert those actionable items into notarized documents that reflect your values and ideas. None of these things will be perfect, and I just suggest accepting the fact that you may need to change things as you go, and sometimes pay the cost of it. I hope you don't need to, but you will be better off just assuming that that is a possibility, and it's not the end of the world if that happens. That's better than just not doing anything. So I want to move us now to you, our attendees today. We have 36 people right now logged in, and we would like to ask you some questions just to get to know you a little better. So you should be seeing on your screens a first question out of just 4 that we're going to do today. It asks, which generations are attending this webinar from your location today? So please take a few minutes to answer. Okay, so we have almost everyone voted. So I'm going to end this. And I am going to share the results with you. You should be seeing those results on your screen now. And what we see is that 60% of the people that are attending today are part of the senior generation. 20 junior and 20% does not apply. So thank you for answering those questions, or this question. And we're going to try to tailor the talk to you.
There was almost everybody responded, and so those are rounded averages. But we could see how many people responded, so almost everybody did. So thank you.
I am going to stop sharing these and try to ask another question. So see if you see that on your screen now. The second question is, what type of farm or types of farm enterprises does your family operate? And you should be able to choose more than one.
And there are some that you need to scroll down for if you don't notice the bar on your right there.
And we've got at least somebody in almost every category.
And just one more person just voted. And I think we're just going to stop it here. So you should be seeing the results now.
Wow, we got a lot of fruit trees in operations. That's interesting.
Yep.
We got some cash crops and some dairy farms, some beef farms, some swine farms, and cash crops, nursery operations, a little bit of everything. So that's good. That's great.
Yes, thank you everyone for responding. I am actually going to now stop sharing. And I'm going to ask Roger a question. Roger, what does a good succession plan try to accomplish? What does it look like? Roger, I think we're seeing your presenter mode. Am I right, Stan?
Yep.
You may want to try to make it larger or change.
Uh-oh, what's happening?
It'll be right up there at the top. You can change.
Well, I goofed up, folks. Sorry.
It's fine.
I think I'm sharing the wrong screen is what happened.
Well, you can probably move stuff to the other screen. I don't know.
Share.
Take your time.
Okay, we'll get it. We'll try this again. Everybody can see the problems.
There we go.
That better?
Yes, and I'm actually going to repeat the question so that
Sorry.
It's fine. So what does this good succession plan try to accomplish, and what does it look like?
I've done a lot of work over the years, and I've kind of created some different kinds of goals, as I call them, and we're going to try to focus our session tonight on basically looking at these different goals. And the goal number one, which I find is very important, is that we have to have financial independence and security for the current owners, which is the parent business. And because we don't have that, the whole plan doesn't work. And the parent generation, they've worked a lifetime to accumulate what they have. And the whole plan has to work within their their desires within their financial security. Goal number 2 is, which did not come up. What's happening now? Oh, come on, folks. Why is it not advancing?
There we go.
Huh.
Just
I don't know. The second goal is to have family harmony, where everybody can kind of get along. We still talk to each other. We still can have Christmas dinner together, those kinds of things. And because sometimes the family gets a lot of stress. Families, they tend to, they get along fine. But when parents pass away, it's kind of like the last time. You kind of, some buildup stresses and so forth can kind of come forward and bear their ugly head. And so sometimes we do have family issues. The third goal is to provide an opportunity for the farming heirs. And one of the things that is very important is that each generation must earn their own way, or the business will eventually fail. And otherwise, you're just going to live off the equity of the senior generation, what they've created, and not add to that. We need to have a plan where they can take off from that spot where they're at, and transition and move forward and have a successful opportunity looking forward. And the fourth goal is to have a plan that's relatively flexible. We can get these things so complicated that it's hard to understand them, and we need to have flexibility so that we can change things as the events may happen on down the road. We'll spend more time on each of these topics as we go forward. The fifth one is a simple one. Keep it relatively simple. As I started to say, for flexibility, if you can't understand it, how are you going to manage it, those type of things. And sometimes we get them so complex that we just can't kind of follow along with them. Guess what the sixth one is? The sixth one is sometimes what we spend most of the time on, and that's minimal additional income and estate taxes. Notice that's my sixth goal, and in this order. Over my years in working with this, I find that most of the issues that people bring up and families have somehow fits underneath of these 6 goals, and trying to simultaneously balance these things. There's no computer program that will calculate all this stuff for you and give you an answer. It takes individual situations and those type of things in order to figure out what is the best plan. There is no cookbook for this stuff. Everyone is a little bit different for various reasons and different circumstances and different situations.
thank you, Roger. So how does the senior generation know if they are financially secure? We said that that was the first goal.
Well, how do you know that? Well, we hope that parents are reasonably comfortable in their financial position. What does that mean? They have enough disposable money, income to provide for their needs and be able to do what they want. And part of our exercises and so forth that we'll talk about tonight are how you kind of come to get to that comfort level. Have access to cash in an emergency situation happens to come up. We need to have maybe some retirement home cost if that's a possibility. How's that going to work? It could be assisted living cost, health insurance. And another big item is sometimes we underestimate what the future needs might be. People forget about, gosh, inflation. They forget about other costs that might pop up. Some of those emergencies, they tend to underestimate what they can live on. And so we want to make sure that there's enough cushion in there and enough wiggle room, if you will, so that the parents can feel comfortable and secure in their generation. What's retirement look like? How many years you're going to live? It kind of makes a difference, you know. How many more car purchases are you going to make between now and then? What's your health insurance going to cost? Who's going to pay for the cell phone if it's not going to be buried in the farm like it usually is on a lot of farm operations? Who's going to pay for what becomes very important. Where are you going to live? You're going to live at the house where you've been at for a long time. You're going to move away. You're going to spend part of the time in the Caribbean or in Florida, those kinds of things. 6 months out of the year, all those things affect what your retirement looks like and what the plan needs to try to accomplish so that you can achieve what your goals may be. What happens if you no longer take care of yourself? You're going to be living with kids, and some people do that. That can be very cost effective and so forth, and it can save on a lot of cost, but that takes a lot of emotion and work by everybody involved. One thing, my mother, when she was getting elderly, she did not want anybody to have to take care of her. It's just some of her values, and she was not going to have any family members have to take care of her. I think that comes from her when she had to take care of her mother, and I don't think she enjoyed that a lot. And so as a result, when she got older, she didn't want to put that burden on anybody else, and so she made sure she had enough funds and incomes in order to live in assisting care for a while, nursing care home eventually as she got older. What does the farm need to provide? Okay, how much revenue does the elder generation need? What's the farm need to provide to the successor generation? Where's the cash flow? What's it going to look like? How big is the pot of money from the farm? How many families can the farm afford? Can it provide for a succeeding generation? Is the elder generation to a degree that meets each of their needs and so forth? What happens if it doesn't work? What are you going to do? How are you going to work that out? What are you going to think about? Are you going to expand? Are you going to keep off farm businesses, off farm incomes, supplement? A lot of families have one of the spouses working off farm with just right health insurance. I do a lot of income tax work with folks, and I had a family today that's only of a moderate sized family, had 2 children in their 40s, and their health cost was $19,000 a year, 19 thousands. That's a huge. I remember when it broke 10,000 about 15 years ago. I was just shocked at the cost of what health insurance is, and that just keeps on going up. Financial needs will help us determine the next steps in terms of trying to figure out and give us something to talk about as we move forward, thinking about what the business and how we make these things work.
But Roger, are there tools to use to help us organize and think through?
Yeah, there's if you go on the web and if you search and Google retirement planning, you will be inundated with hundreds of different places to go look for stuff. I happened to look Purdue, University of Purdue Extension, our equivalents in Indiana. They have a real nice site that provides a lot of up-to-date information and several things. One, they've got a kind of a workbook and things that, oh gosh, I think it had 8 or 10 different major kind of steps. Maybe do one of those a day or something like that to help you think through a lot of those things. You should have a retirement information worksheet that either Florencia is going to send to you, or she already has. I'm not sure which way it was.
I sent it earlier today. Yeah.
Okay, very good. And so you should have that as an attachment with you. And what I like to do is have the wife and the husband have both spouses fill that out separately and to be honest with it, and then kind of sit down and have a little discussion or powwow on it, I sometimes call it, and to talk about things. Well, I didn't know you wanted that, or gosh, I thought we would do this, or gosh, I thought that we could do this, and well, let's talk about it. And so it becomes a communication vehicle process in order for folks to start talking. The questions to start off with are just things. I'm not going to read all these off for you, but it's kind of probing kinds of questions. What do you want to do? Where you guys want to live, all those kinds of things. Then it gets into another section, which gets into personal household budget. And this is just the top part of that handout that's there in that PDF file. And so it helps you to try to think through what are the costs and think about it and try to put some concrete numbers together. A lot of times in a farm situation, a lot of that stuff kind of gets buried within the family, within the farm budget and those type of things. Sometimes it's hard to kind of sort it out and understand what it is. It's not bad for both the senior generation and the junior generation to kind of spend some time doing this. What is the money that the farm's going to need to provide in various forms and so forth for each of those generations? If it doesn't work financially, how's it possibly going to work? And at least on paper, trying to think it through.
Thank you, Roger. So I have another question. What income streams might a retired couple plan on having at that stage?
Yeah, there's the normal stuff. There's retirement incomes from wages that you might still work a little bit. It could be on the farm, it could be off farm. There could be some wages to go with it. So of course, Social Security, what are those payments going to be? You could have obviously some retirement accounts, some 401ks, some IRAs, those kinds of things. But you also, a lot of farms, the retirement is buried in that farm. A lot of the income and profits that wasn't disposed of through family living type things was plowed back into the farm. And so sometimes we think about, forget about, I should say, in terms of what kinds of incomes might be available for the senior generation. Cash crop farms, not so much fruit operations, but cash crop farms, well, fruit farms do too. They'll hold sales and so forth till next year to try to spread out the income. And sometimes we can do that in cash crop farms where this income is kind of sold maybe to the over time. And what I mean by that is we'll get into some more details later, but we'll have some sales maybe to the junior generation. And the junior generation then buys that over time and pays you back over time as a way to kind of spread out some income for crops. We'll talk about that more later. Of course, you may have some livestock that can be breeding livestock, fat cattle, those kinds of things. A lot of inventory, crop supplies sitting on hand, prepaid expenses, those kinds of things that can be sources of income for the senior generation. We're going to focus on transitioning, not just a sell-off, or this whole focus of this workshop is trying to make this work so it can continue on to another generation, obviously. So they're a little bit different if you're just going to basically retire and the farm's going to retire as well versus continue on. Rent or sale of machinery is another source of income. And we can utilize rent or an installment sale, rent to own type concepts. There's some income tax issues you've got to kind of worry about to make that work properly, but we've done it numerous times over the years and been successful in spreading out some income over time from the junior generation buying or renting those assets from the senior generation as a way to make it work. Of course, you have buildings and you have land, and you can rent and or sell those assets, and probably the hierarchy of stuff probably starts at the top, works its way on down in terms of trying to think about putting together cash flow projections, those type of things, and working with trying to figure out what kind of senior sources of income that you have to work with. And so as a senior generation, you've got to kind of think a little bit different. It's not just Social Security. You've got all these other assets that are real asset, and we can use some slow sales, some soft sales, some different kinds of tools in order to create both income and a way to transfer ownership to the younger generation of those different components of the farm business.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry. So in thinking about this, how do you actually determine? There's kind of a process. It's not rocket science. It's understanding the farm's true financial standing, and that includes balance sheets and accrual income statements. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Retirement plan has these household budgets we just talked about and retirement budgets for both generations. How much money really has to come out of the farm one way or another, either as rent income maybe to the senior generation and so forth. The successor generation, the household budget, they can develop that as well. And once we get the succession plans, these parts of this kind of put together, and then we can start to develop a full financial long-range plan and cash flows for each of the options to see which one kind of works, which one doesn't work, come back to what those goals are and trying to balance those goals. What will happen, there's trade-offs because you can't achieve all those goals. You're going to find conflicts within those goals that we're talking about. And so number one here is on this whole financial security for the senior generation, or the most financially secure for the senior generation is to sell everything. There's some income tax issues and stuff that away someplace in a very safe financial instrument or something, okay? But that doesn't achieve any of the other goals that we talk about. So anyway, so there's always trade-offs in trying to think about these different goals and so forth. The balance sheet is a mainstay in any kind of financial analysis. What are your assets? What are your liabilities? And I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the balance sheet helps communicate to yourselves, most importantly, to also maybe the junior generation that's going to come into the farm. That means sharing, yes, some personal information. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable doing that, but we need to have a trusting relationship with the younger generation so that they can understand and on both sides of the equation. The balance sheet is called a balance sheet because you have all your total assets. You add them all together. Notice I've got personal separated out. A lot of times with Greenstone or other banks and so forth, the personal and the business assets kind of get all intertwined together. That makes it difficult to analyze the business, what the business is really doing. And so we want to try to separate those out. Retirement accounts, 401ks, the house that you live in, if it's not on the farm, that kind of gets a little bit difficult to sort that out. But just sort those things out and have a list of those items. That helps facilitate communication very well. You're working with myself, working with my colleagues here, working with any kind of estate planner. They're going to want to know, what are we dealing with? And the most efficient way to show that is a simple balance sheet. We list all the assets. We also list the liabilities. The liabilities should correspond to the asset. Liabilities on machinery, of course, would be against the machinery that you own. Long-term, typically, of course, is land, real estate, those kinds of things. Personal might be a car loan or a house loan or some other boat or cottage up north or whatever those things may be. So you add up your total liabilities and, of course, total assets minus your total liabilities equals your equity, and total liabilities plus your equity, of course, equals the assets, and that's why they call it the balance sheet, because if you put your equity on the right, you add everything up and they come out the same number. So that's one important part. There's lots of tools that can help you put a balance sheet together. If you're any sizable operation, I'm sure you probably got lots of experience in working with those things. The other thing is what's the true business income statement, and that needs to be accrual adjustment income. Most farms just use straight cash accounting, and they don't necessarily make the accrual adjustments. Cash accounting is just what goes through the checkbook and ignores and not adjust for inventories, unpaid bills, accrued interest, some of those kinds of things. And so want to have an accrual adjusted income statement that tells us what the real business profit of the business is, what's just simply on Schedule F, or tax returns. Of course, you all know doesn't tell the whole story of what's really going on. And of course, looks at those changes in those accounts receivable, crop inventory, and prepaids. Got ahead of myself, accrued interest. Those are all things that are used in the accrual adjustment. Unpaid bills or accounts payable are also some items that did you pay the real estate taxes on December 31, or did you wait till next year? That's all income tax management kinds of things that I'm working with right now with farmers at this time of the year. At this time, it's time for our other speaker to kind of come up a little bit. And one of my goals was, our second goal is family harmony. Okay, what is family harmony? How do you, what are we talking about here, Stan? Not hearing you, Stan.
You're muted.
Stan, you're muted.
All right. We know what we're doing. Can you hear me now?
There you are.
All right.
Yes.
Let's go back down through this. All right, family harmony. Roger actually mentioned a couple of these earlier. When you think about farm business, one of the unique things is that this is a family business. And so, that's why this goal of family harmony is so important, because we step away from the farm, we come in from the milking parlor, we come in from the field, and can we still get along with our decision making? especially as we go through this farm transition process. So really setting up that farm transition plan to allow us to continue to get along, even if Joe decides that Joe doesn't want to farm anymore, or something happens that causes some family member to leave. Somebody passes away. How do we account for those things so that we continue to have family harmony? We want you to still be able to meet for holidays and do those traditional family activities, and enjoy each other's company. Those are critical things in a family business to be able to survive.
Well, I get that, Stan, and we all want to get along. That's all, nice to say. But how do you really do it? How do you actually, what do you do? What can we talk about in this webinar tonight that families can actually do to improve that?
Yeah, and I say communication as my next bullet there, and obviously that's easy said, hard done. But it's communicating all those wants and needs that you as an individual have, that generations have between generations, that family versus, or farming heirs versus non-farming heirs. It's really about going down through that process and really making sure everybody knows what everybody else vision is, goals are, what their wants and needs are, so we can get those out on the table and start to put together a plan that makes sense and works for people. So I say communication is the key. And in a recent study by the Williams Group, they looked at 3,250 families whose businesses failed in the second and third generation. And I want you to look at those top three reasons there. Breakdown of trust and communication, 65%. So nearly 2/3 of the businesses failed because of this communication issue. They lost trust. Well, trust is lost when we don't communicate well, when we assume that somebody else means something different than what they said. There's lots of reasons why we can start to break down that trust. Failure to prepare heirs for their roles and responsibilities. We're going to talk about that later tonight. Lack of family mission and vision. That certainly is one of those communication things. And then look at the last one. And we spend a lot of time on, boy, give me that right tool to use. Should I use an estate? Should I use a trust, Roger? Should I use a will? What all should I use? Less than 5% of the businesses failed because they did something wrong in the choices that they made in putting together their estate plan as far as tools. So yes, those are important. We're going to come back to those, mention them at least, but that's not why businesses fail. When I look at communication, it really has two parts. So I've got a friend of mine that talks about, colleague that talks about, every time you talk to somebody, it's a spouse, it's your coworker, boss, friend, employee, you're doing two things. One, you're communicating content. You're getting across whatever you need to communicate. But second is you're either going to build or tear down a relationship by the way you communicate. So we got to think about the content, and then we have to think about how we communicate. Those are both extremely important.
So I have a question, Stan.
Yeah.
What areas do you see as important in communicating between generations?
Okay, well, let's take a look at 4 of those. There's obviously lots of areas, but I limited it to 4 for tonight's presentation. And I'm going to talk about each one of these in more detail, but we need to communicate. This is the what that we need to communicate, not the how yet. So vision and goals, expectations, logistics, and transition plan. So we're going to talk about each one of those a little bit more in these upcoming slides. Vision and goals, between the generations, you really need to be able to clearly articulate where you're seeing this farm in the future. And that could be significantly different from one generation to the next, right? So that junior generation might have what the senior generation might think are some pretty wild-haired ideas about where this farm's going to go. But we need to get those out on the table and say, what are we expecting this farm to look like in the future? And then what are the goals to get us there, to that vision? And as I said, it's not uncommon for those goals to be inconsistent between generations. but getting them out on the table, starting to talk about them, starting to look for some common goals that we can work on together, or where I may need to adjust my goal a little bit as a senior generation to make room for that junior generation and what they would like to do. That's the conversation that needs to happen around that vision and goals. Second is expectation. And so what are your roles? What do you see as your roles? What do you see as others' roles in this process? And for sure, these will and should change during this transition process. So what starts out today that I think, okay, my role at the beginning of this transition is going to be X. I'm going to be responsible for this part of the business. Well, you would hope that that would change in a transition plan to where down the road, I've got a little more responsibility in my roles.
Stan, I would think that it's very clear for everybody what their role is. Do you have a real example from real life where you have experienced an issue in this area with farms you've worked with?
Oh, absolutely. Probably too many for tonight to talk about, but I can mention one real recent experience working with a farm. So here's your senior generation and two siblings, the junior generation. And boy, the senior generation had a pretty clear idea what they thought the roles of the siblings should be. They're going to work together in perfect harmony and get along and co-manage this business 50-50. And life will be grand. And so that's when I was talking with the senior generation, but then I talked to each one of the junior generations separately, just because that's kind of how it worked out. And it was interesting to find out from one of the siblings that, well, he didn't think the sister was going to be interested in farming at all. And so he was pretty sure he was going to run this all by himself. But if he had to, if she was interested, he would certainly need to be in control and make the final decision. So, and then in conversations with the sibling, she said, well, yeah, I'll work with him, but I have to have at least 51% control because I need to be controlled in the end. So, boy, and nobody knew that up to that point in time. So where role is shared, not real well in that particular situation that they had shared what the roles were going to be in the process.
And I'll bet you I've had the same experiences, and that I'll bet that daughter, the one who wanted to have the 51 or whatever, in contrast, was a younger child.
Oh yeah.
And so she was the one that always got bossed around by big brother. And when she became an adult, she was not going to be pushed around by her big brother.
Yeah, and had different views of where they wanted to see the farm go too, for sure. So if you kind of got an idea that your sibling might be looking at a total different area, then you're going to want control rather than working that out. So that was important to get that out on the table. So the third area, logistics. So this is, how you operate the farm as a leader. And boy, this is being pretty transparent as a senior generation and pretty vulnerable to say, okay, this is why I make the decisions that I make. This is why I farm to begin with, and kind of my philosophy. And it's kind of letting that junior generation, if you look at the old idiom of looking behind the curtain or seeing the sausage being made, it's really getting into the details of why we make the decisions that we do. And that means letting that successor become your shadow and following you around the farm, you really providing the coaching. It's so easy to just say, here's the keys to the farm. When I'll give them to you when I'm done, and you can do it the way you want to do it. But that leaves out this whole area of helping that junior generation get started, really understanding the business, why you make decisions, and then kind of bringing their own expertise to that. And then the last area is obviously very important. That's the transition plan. So, we're going to spend a lot of the time tonight on this particular part. So are you clearly communicating how and when you see the transition plan being accomplished? At least letting the junior generation know this is our timetable. And then beginning to get stuff written down. Do both generations agree on the plan? Well, probably not completely when they start, but they should be able to come up with some compromises. And then how are you going to communicate that then with the non-farming heirs? Roger's going to get into, you know, equitable versus equal. And you got to have those hard conversations with both the farming heirs and the non-farming heirs. Roger, you want to share a story in this regard, or I can share the story as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, Roger and I were at a conference recently on this, and talking about a transition plan and how important this is for the junior generation. And I know like 2/3 of our audience, or 60% of our audience tonight, is that senior generation. So I put a challenge out to you there that we had a young lady speaking at a conference, and she basically left her family's farm to move and become a part of her husband's family's farm strictly because of this. So they were working with her family farm, really wanted to become members of that, partners of that, could not get the senior generation to even begin to share a transition plan, or even that there was a plan to have a transition plan. And got a call late at night one night, and from her husband's parents, and said, hey, we'd like you to come out west and become partners on our operation. They packed up the bags and left. And so if you really want that junior generation to stay around, stay engaged, you got to start this process. And Roger and I and Florencia would all say, you know, you got to start that early. The earlier, the better with that junior generation. So how do we communicate? We talked about the what, let's talk about the how. Webster would say it's exchange of thoughts, messages, information. That's the what, right? But the how is often a problem for us because we're not real good at communication. We don't have good listening skills. We sometimes lack the ability to get our points across. And I got a quote there from Stephen Covey that you've most likely heard. Seek first to be understood, or to understand, and then to be understood. So how can we improve those communication skills? Well, get to know people, you know, that you're visiting with, know them by name. That includes employees, you know, using positive speech, recognizing that meanings are really in people, not words. What do I mean by that? Well, words have the same word can have 3 different meanings. So you really have to understand what the person is trying to say with those words. And again, we don't all use the right words. So it's asking for clarification. It's finding out, you know, what did you mean by that? Boy, listening barriers can get in the way. You know, I have a tendency of, you know, kind of walking out of the room as I'm talking, or when my spouse is talking, you know, and we're continue to talk. Well, that's not good listening. That's kind of faking attention. Sometimes we're nodding our head and then we respond to the wrong thing. That's a pretty good cue that you weren't really paying attention well.
One of the things that, Stan, that just sends me off to be totally irresponsible if somebody's not listening to what I have to say. That just really bothers me.
Yeah.
Okay? And I need to improve my skills, okay, in terms of listening to them, because maybe I'm not listening to them and they're not listening to me, okay? And so you can, if you don't have to agree, but at least listen to me.
Yep. Yeah, they actually say, Roger, that things that really bother us are probably weaknesses of ourselves.
That's a subtle hint. I appreciate that, Sam. Frenchie gets it too.
Yeah. And then the very last point, you're using your filters. You know, we all come from different backgrounds. The senior generation has a different background than the junior generation. And we hear things through our own filters, through our own experiences. And we tell ourselves a story with those words that other person is using that may be completely off base from what they actually meant. So if we're speaking, you know, speaking at a moderate rate, you know, giving feedback to an individual, clarifying, rephrasing what people say so that you get a chance to really understand, is this what you meant? I just heard you say this, and really trying to rephrase those. Thinking before you speak. These are just a few more additional hints. Yeah, obviously knowing your audience, being specific and simplifying. Boy, I can ramble with the best of them. So I have to stop every once in a while and say, okay, what are you trying to say? You know, what's most important? What are you trying to get across? Try to be as as logical in your presentation. Boy, when you're communicating between generations, I had a colleague that said she was recommending to the generations to actually write down questions ahead of time before the transition meeting, especially for that junior generation, because you don't want to put the senior generation on a defensive mode by asking questions, but yet you need information. And so write it down ahead of time, and really work through the way you want to ask a question. And then be patient and summarize what you're saying, summarize your main points, reiterate your main points so that people are understanding you. You messages can really get us in trouble. And so try to pull those out of your talk. I noticed tonight that several of you showed up a little late to our meeting. And does that put you on the defensive a little bit? Maybe it could do that. Or I've heard said, why did you do that? How could you do that? Those types of messages really put people on the defensive and put walls up and start to build distrust. And so we encourage you to replace those with I messages and really thinking through the effects that it has on you. When I showed up tonight, I noticed that there were only a few people here and I felt disappointed, and so really focusing on your own feelings, the effects that it's had on you versus accusing someone else, and really trying to keep the judgments out of there. I'm not good at figuring out people's motives. We pay judges to do that, pay them pretty well, I think, to judge people's motives. Try not to do that. It's pretty easy to do. Continuing on the I messages, if you do that, it puts the responsibility back on yourself, the sender, and it reduces the other person's defensiveness. You're not evaluating the person then. You're not saying, hey, you're wrong, or you're wrong to do that, or how could you do that? Really trying to stick with the I messages, promote communication, build trust, and create empathy.
Part of that, Stan, is as I think about in talking with younger generational folks, most of these young folks are really responsible people. You think about, their position that they're in. They kind of want, they do want to farm, they want to make it work. They know the financial burdens, how difficult it's going to be. And it's hard because you kind of want to make this thing work, but you kind of depend on the parents to help you out a little bit. And so you hate to ask questions about stuff because you're afraid that you're pushing it and pushing them, and it gets very, very difficult for a younger generation to approach this stuff and without appearing to be what's the right word, expecting too much kinds of things, but at the same time, how can it work? What can I expect? And so this communication becomes very, very important, and it's often hard to do. It's easy to talk about, but to really do it, you've got to work at it.
Yep. Yeah, and on the other side of that, Roger, I've heard senior generations say, they're not saying anything or asking anything, so they must not be really that interested in the farming operation, or I don't think they're ready to take on management. Well, it could be that they're just scared to death to ask you questions. So as a senior generation, encouraging them to ask questions, to get them to, and try to let them know that it's okay to ask the question wrong. Because again, we come from different generations. We've had different experiences. We're going to approach things differently. It's really easy. Myself, I won't speak for Roger, but myself as getting older, it's really easy to forget the business of a younger person's life with kids and everything going on. And shoot, I can work into the wee hours of the night and it doesn't affect anybody but myself and my wife. And if she's content to do crafts, I'm content to work, and so things change and you can easily start to forget, where that other person is at. So encourage them to speak up, encourage them to ask questions, share with them your thoughts, and encourage them to share back.
One of the things that, at least what I grew up with, and I'm guilty of it myself, is, my God, can't you see what we're doing? Can't you figure out what the next step is? And in some logical process, well, somebody else, I'm thinking of employees and or family members, it just comes natural. Well, it doesn't come natural. So you got to work with people and help understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, we have to remind ourselves that as educators that you can get wrapped up into, you've said it enough times that, well, surely you've got that, and it's easy to do that with the junior generation, just kind of expecting that they're going to get it by osmosis, and probably not going to happen. So again, just some differences between older and younger generations. And, it's easy I've heard senior generations walk away from a meeting and say, that went pretty well. And junior generation going, I don't think we talked about anything. So they're pretty satisfied with a slower pace in the transition, that, a little bit of communication is pretty good. We don't have too many problems here. And they also have a higher value on the physical assets because they've built them over all these years. So it's, that's something that's harder for them to put at risk than the younger generation. So just understand that as you're going through this process. And just I've mentioned a few of these already. I'm just going to click down through these just in the interest of time, but you'll have these slides. Florencia, are we sharing these slides with the?
Well, that's a good question. People were asking whether we could share the slides, and I wanted to check with you two first, whether to share just the recording, which we are recording, and we are going to share the recording for sure. But if you're also okay with me sharing the slides, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. They will get a copy of these slides. That was our intent, I think. So
cool.
These are just some things to stay away from, and really some good examples of words not to use. Okay. But
Stan, can you give me a little example back here? Let's try a couple of those.
Sure. Well, you better stop cutting me off, Roger. Because we kind of need to get through this presentation. If you don't stop, that would be a threaten, Roger.
What would be a nicer way to say that to me?
I am worried that we are not going to finish on time. So I would need your help in speeding things up.
Okay.
The use of the I word there, Florencia. I mentioned earlier about this, the you stuff. I was at a farm transition meeting with a family, and the spouse of the son, the junior generation, said to her father-in-law, "How could you do this? How could you make these decisions?" And I thought, oh my. And you could see the walls go up and the communication stop, because the accusation was made that he was mismanaging things. So really think through, expressing yourself. She had a real fear that the farm wasn't in a good position. It would have been good to share that fear of, I'm worried about the assets versus the liabilities. How can we make this work into the future? And then we talked about these earlier, just to remember and to end this section on a positive note, that there's a lot of things that we can do well. We can learn to be better listeners. We can invite people to respond back to what we've said. We can summarize what we say. And then when Roger says something to me, I can say, Roger, I think this is what you said, but is that what you meant? Can you clarify? And give him an opportunity to correct me if I misunderstood him.
So we are going to do another poll, and then we're going to take a couple minutes break, and we'll review the answers to the poll when we come back. So this is our third question. Take your time to answer, then just take a couple minutes to stretch, get some water or something, and we'll come back in just a couple minutes.
All right, I'm going to take your advice and get my water filled up.
Go ahead.
I already did.
I think you are going to need a break for something else in a little bit, Roger, if you keep drinking water.
Doctor says drink lots of water.
We are going to have another break later, in case you all are wondering. So. So as we come back, Roger and Stan, somebody asked on the Q&A, how are the two siblings that each want 51% control going to get it done, or how did they get it done if they did? I don't know if you want to follow up on that or just, and we also have somebody who raised their hand.
Okay.
Sure.
I could allow them to talk or ask them to type in the question.
Well, why don't we save the audio for the end? Just
Okay.
get through the slides, but and then we can give them control. If they want to type it in now, that's great. The farm family's making some progress. I mean, it led to a rough discussion because they were pretty, they were goals that weren't compatible, as we talked about, so you had to kind of think through, okay, here's some options, folks. We come to an agreement that we're in an equal partnership here. We, is the farm big enough for, if the goals are so different from one another, is there a possibility that, there could be two smaller farming operations in the future? So we talked through some of those options. They're still working through what they would like to do as a family. So, yeah.
Thank you, Stan.
Discussions, just, continue to move forward when you run into those. Don't let them be roadblocks.
Okay, and the question from Frank, who is the one that was raising his hand, we are probably going to leave this one for the end, because it sounds like it's got some detail he may want to share. But to keep going on our presentation now, I'm going to share the results from the poll. You should be seeing those on your screens now.
Yeah, we got some that are 41%, and they're under 1 year looking at, and then we've got kind of a 1 to 3 years, and then we got a kind of a hole there in terms of the time period, and some more than 10 years, and that's not uncommon for people to struggle with this. I've worked with families, some of them for 10, 15 years, trying to develop some kind of a plan, and you kind of think it through, and yep, that work sounds okay, and then they set on it, and then they say, well, what about this? What about that? Well, there's a problem here, and how do you deal with this? And so that's what often happens. We're trying to help with this webinar to help folks to move forward.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing those results. And so as we move out of all the communication topics that Stan was talking about, and we talked a lot about siblings and about transferring assets to farming or non-farming heirs, I have a question for you, Roger. Are there any ways to transfer assets to heirs that are equitable, but maybe not necessarily equal?
I just happen to have a slide on that, and we have lots of different ways. So here's 10 different ways of, we might call it equal or unequitable transfer of stuff. And again, it's not clicking advancing for me. What am I doing wrong? There it goes. Okay, the first obvious one would be gifts of various items to heirs to help them get started farming. Sometimes that's the use of machinery or other assets that at either free to rent it or to use it over time or at a reduced rate. Sometimes we swap labor for machinery and those kinds of things, or physical gifts between them. Often we use sales at less than fair market value. We did that with our daughter. She needed a new car. Didn't have the money to buy a brand new one, anything like that. And my wife was, we don't buy very many cars, but she bought a new car and then sold the old one to our daughter, Melanie, for probably, I don't know, maybe 2/3, 60% of what the value really was. And so we helped her out a little bit in getting her life established and so forth. But and so we just gave her a good deal on things. And that happens a lot on bigger scales with the farm, on various assets that are involved. Sometimes we can use fair wages, and then those fair wages paid to the farming heirs are used to buy assets back from the parents. Is one way that we can do it. We use buy-sell agreements. This is a very important tool that have the exact sale terms. We have options to buy, and an option to buy is different than a first right of refusal. An option to buy is you got the right to buy this piece of land, real estate at this price under these terms. They can be executed through the wills, through trust, LLC agreements, or just an outside option to buy. And use that tool a lot with families to help assure future generation can go forward, and people kind of know what can happen. And with the option to buy, mom and dad can't change it in their wills or trust later on if it's done through an outside tool. Life insurance, the younger generation buys life insurance, or the senior generation pays for the life insurance, with the beneficiaries being the second generation. And the second generation uses that to maybe buy assets out of the estate, those type of things. What happened here? I'm sorry. What's happening? I'm losing my things aren't bouncing like I thought they were. So that's the life insurance on the parents. And then we've got life insurance owned by the heirs. And as I said before, I got off a little bit. The parents would buy the insurance, use the money to buy out the non-farming heirs. Sometimes we have life insurance purchased by the parents, and that life insurance goes to the non-farming heirs as beneficiaries, and that's their inheritance. And the farming heirs inherit the farm assets. It's black and white. Here's what each of them get. The younger generation, the new generation inherits the farm assets. Parents will. That's kind of the last resort through the will. Makes a fair distribution. That is done a lot. I think it's a terrible way to try to divide assets up. I sit down with parents and senior generation, and they try to look at all their assets. They want this to go here and this to go there, and try and divide stuff up. I had one family one time. They had 7 children. They had about 300 acres of ground, and they worked hours and hours and hours and weeks and months and years trying to figure out how to divide that 300 acres up between 7 children equally. Well, there's no way you can do that. Some's got road frontage, some's got a creek, some's got this, some's bigger parcels. How you divide it up in all those pieces, it took an awful long time for them to figure out there's other ways of doing that. Sometimes the farming heirs have received earlier compensation versus what they might inherit from the estate, and they may get nothing out of the estate because they've done some earlier kinds of things to help that business get started. One of the things we want to get that younger generation into some real ownership relatively early in life. I'm talking in their 30s, late 20s, 30s, and 40s, major transfer of assets, of the working assets at least. And if we wait until for example, for the will, well, good heavens, that will probably won't happen until mom and dad are in their 80s or 90s, maybe 100. Well, how old is Junior when mom and dad are 85? Well, heck, he's probably 60, and his kids are already in their late 30s, possibly. And so it just doesn't make sense to wait that long to get some of this process started and get moving in order to have a successful transfer. Of course, non-farming heirs inherit non-farm assets, remote land locations, and I've got a slide that'll help show that later on.
But Roger, how can the senior generation prepare to provide a reasonable opportunity for the next generation to be financially successful?
Well, it's a lot more than just the physical assets. That's kind of easy in a way to deal with. It's really the opportunity is skill sets in terms of training experiences to help that younger family to be self-reliant without the senior generation input. That's the eventual goal, because that's what's going to need to happen if everybody dies in order when they're supposed to. We don't have the junior generation passing away, some accident, something. The goal is to eventually that we get there so that senior generation can kind of back off a little bit, and the junior generation has more and more control. The younger generation needs to be developing management skills and sets. It's kind of a self-serving control of their future. They need to know what they need to do to be successful. Has power to make the decisions that affect their future. For example, a lot of times attorneys, I'll see this, and I see a lot of estate plans like this, of where we take the farm and we say the farm is divided up, or the farm is, we'll put it into a business, an LLC or something, and then we'll give junior generation 2%. Okay, go work your butt off for 2%. Okay, and so they work their butt off, the whole asset gets bigger because of the success of what they did. And now they got to share 98% of that with their farming brothers and sisters, or non-farming brothers and sisters. So they need to have power within their control that helps drive their future. And transferring management skills becomes one of those most important things. Let's see. So again, sort of where Stan was talking about the perception of what the older generation is. It's a fruit operation. We've got a lot of fruit operations. It's a high tunnel system, it looks like. I don't know much about fruit. I'm not a production expert. I did work a lot in the fruit area in Southwest Michigan for quite a few years. And they've got high production. Looks like a good site, good air ventilation, those kinds of things. Really good production site. But then the junior generation, they're thinking about a tourist type spot, a roadside stand, a place where people can go, a destination. They're trying to sell an experience versus the hard commodity apples. And so there's a whole different perspective from the different generations and what they perceive and what they may want to take the operation to. So how does how's the junior generation actually acquire use? And this is just kind of setting some standards in terms of what happens. How can you do it? Well, the junior generation either has to buy it, they have to rent it, it has to be given to you, you can inherit it, or you can steal it. There's no other ways to obtain ownership in property. You can find it laying along the road, those kinds of things, but that's the way you obtain property. It's as simple as that. It's one of those 5 different methods, okay? And of course, combinations of the above are all ways which we can do it. How do you divest? Okay, we got the senior generation. What's the senior generation do? What do they have to do if they're going to divest in property? Okay, they sell it and they convert that from a physical asset into a cash asset. They rent it to someone until it's all wore out. They can give it away. gift is while you're alive. They can be part of their estate. Low rent is a partial gift. Destroy it, have it stolen from you, or lose it, and then combinations of the above. And what happened? Part of your estate. So my got out of order here. Sorry about that. But those are the ways in which you can divest and move assets. And of course, they all have potential tax consequences. And you just have to work through those things. And so those are different ways in which stuff gets transferred between people. And that's a simple concept, but the point is those all have different implications, different tax implications, different things that can be done. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about organization structures and transfer strategies. There's really the different structures that you can have as a business. Sole proprietor is very popular. It can be a modified sole proprietorship where you got some spinoffs. It can be a wage incentive for the younger generation, but you keep it as the parent's business for a while. It can have a wage share. If the business does well, the wages go up a little bit. It can be an enterprise agreement where the junior generation maybe takes care of the feedlot cattle and the parents take care of the brood cows, or it could be peaches versus the apples versus the different kind of crops you might be growing, sweets versus sours, whatever. Those type of enterprises that could be separated within the farm. It could be a joint venture. They kind of farm together, might even have a joint checkbook, but it's really not a formal partnership or an LLC. At the end of the year, they kind of split the income and expenses up as they want. A lease agreement where they can rent some assets, rent some of the land type things, maybe some offset trades for labor, those type of things. Partnerships are where two people are working together. It can either be a general partnership where both people, whatever percent ownership they have. You can also have a limited partnership. And a limited partnership is where you kind of freeze. Maybe the senior generation, we limit their exposure. We limit their profit sharing. They kind of fix their net worth within that partnership. They fix it at $1 million or whatever the number is. They take a 5% return on that. So they pull $50,000 a 5% return on the $1 million equity that they've got in that partnership. And anything above or below that is shared with the general partner within the limited partnership. And so the general partner, usually the younger generation, then would have any profits above, and also the risk of equity going out. Now, in terms of what equity they may have in there. Of course, the limited partner, if they go completely insolvent or lose or start using some of the $1 million, for my example, that is at risk. Another form of business in Michigan is a limited liability company. They've been around for probably 15, 20 years now. It is the preferred business method for most folks that want to work together in some type of a joint operation. There's a LLC, which is a limited liability company. As a term, is also a limited liability person. And so one person can be a limited liability company. It's more of a risk exposure to liabilities is the reason that they have that. You can have a corporate structure, and a corporate structure can be a sub S, where the income tax obligation it goes to the stockholders versus to a C corp, and a C corp is a regular corp, and the corporation pays its own taxes. It's a separate entity, and you have employees, and then the owners of the corp are often the employees. You can do that in a sub S as well. Some Social Security benefits that you can have by having a sub S, and that's a lot of fruit operations I think tend to be a sub S, at least up in the on the west side of the state I found in terms of that type of corporation. C corps were a lot of them were in the mid 70s. That was kind of the status quo, and we have some problems with those C corps, especially when you try to transfer assets that have appreciated, like land. Land in a C corp becomes problematic in terms of trying to figure out how to get money out of that operation with a strong equity that's in it. If the equity, the corporation sells some land, units within the family. There's income tax on that. And then that money sitting inside the corp. And then how do you get the money out of the corp? It only comes out in the form of wages or dividends, and that gets taxed again. And so that's what they call the double tax of a C corporation. Working assets can work pretty good, but try to keep the real estate outside of that business. And of course, combinations, all these are very possible. And of course, the more the sole proprietor, as far as degree of complexity, a sole proprietor is very simple, has the least complexity. And the most complexity, of course, is when we have combinations. And there's no absolute right way to do things. I'm more concerned about the activities, what is within these businesses, how they relate to each other. Where's the partnership to the sole proprietorship? The parents stay as a sole proprietor, and the partnership or the LLC, I should say. I use those terms interchangeably sometimes. Rents assets from the sole proprietor and those kind of things.
Well, Roger, that all sounds great, but how do you make it all work? What about those families that only have farm assets or mostly have all farm assets that are needed to farm?
Well, we've talked about those options to buy to the farming heirs. A lot of times on the real estate, it might be an option to buy at the SEV, at the state equalized value, which is theoretically half of the market value. A lot of times those option to buys have got terms within it. They've got terms that say that not only can you buy this from the estate at the SEV value, but you've got 30 years at the lowest federal applicable rate. Today, that interest rate's around 1.5% is the rate. It's really low cost right now, and that is fixed for the life of that 30 years. So that's what it's set up. It's when the transaction starts. Is when that goes on forever. So even if we have inflation down the road and interest rates go up, it still stays at that number. And that helps secure the younger generation because they've got this guaranteed option to buy. It's outside of the trust. It's outside of the wills and the operating agreements of the business. It's an option to buy provided to the younger generation. It gives them security. It gives them a future. Gives them something that they can count on. It's black and white. Okay. Another item is the farming heirs buys from the estate at fair market or a discounted price. That can be in the will. That could still be changed, of course, or within the trust agreements that you may be using in terms of providing this opportunity. But the parents can change it, or one parent dies and the next one changes their mind. I have a long story about that happening, which we don't have time tonight to talk about where parents made up the plan, was in the trust and so forth. The farming heir had the rights to buy this stuff. I think it was at 2/3 of twice the SEV value. And so it was about a third discount on the cost of buying things. Had terms of how many years, what the interest rates would be, and then dad died suddenly, unexpectedly, from cancer in like a 4-week period. It was really, really quick. And then mom had some second thoughts, and other family members had second thoughts, and so it was in the trust, and so it got messy. What this does is all of a sudden, if we have these options to buy, or we have these agreements and understandings documented within your trust and wills, those kind of agreements, it creates a cash equivalent. Okay, and so Junior's got the right to buy this $1 million farm for $600,000, 60% of fair market value. And so now, for distribution purposes, that asset is worth $600,000. That gets divided equally amongst his brothers and sisters. Okay, and he's only got one, so there's two of them for easy figuring. And so he inherits his half of that $600,000, and his sister inherits the other half of that $600,000 value, that dead instrument within the estate. And so then Junior, if she doesn't have other assets that come out of estate, then he can effectively buy her out over time, and he owns the land. He's got some debts to go with it, but it gives a a very nice and clean, easy way if you can convert these physical assets into cash equivalents that you can decide how you want to do it. If the farming heir is smaller than what the option is to buy it, then has to buy or take on debt, as I kind of tried to explain there. Farming heirs pays over time to the estate and divides it out to the non-farming heirs.
Sounds a little bit complicated, Roger.
Yeah, it is. I didn't do a very good job. Maybe we can take a look at an example. Say we got a $2 million in asset with only $150,000 in cash and non-farming assets. There's 4 children, and one of them has farmed with you for 20-some years. What do you do? How can you make this work? Well, here would be what would happen if these assets, here's our $2 million worth of stuff. I'll use the pointer over here. Here's this cash and crops. Here's some non-farm assets. So there's $150,000 of non-farm assets. There's $2 million of total assets for illustration. But most of these assets are all tied up in the farm. There's only $150,000 that's not tied up in the farm. So how can we have Farmer Scott basically buy all this stuff, inherit all this stuff, and have everybody equal? Okay, this is all equal. Is it equitable? Okay, and so we can split the cash up amongst the 3 other non-farming kids. We can take the non-farm assets, $100,000, divide that up amongst the 3 children, and then the Farmer Scott, he's got 1.85 million is what he needs to run the farm. And so you down look at this. If he inherits at 1.8 million, and then he would have debt with the estate or with his brothers and 2 sisters for 1.3 million down here. So they'd have, each of them or the estate as a whole would have 1.35 or 450,000 per person for non-farming heir. The total inheritance is 500,000. The farming kids get 50,000 up front and 450,000 spread out over the terms of the debt instrument of where Junior Scott, Farmer Scott, has to pay into the estate. So what's his debt level? Okay, his debt level at 2.5% would be a $21,500 payment for each year to these kids. He's in 73% debt to asset level, so he's pretty heavily leveraged. Probably cash flow is going to be pretty tough, I would imagine, unless he's got a real profitable business, and certainly isn't the fruit industry with what's happened that the last few years with them and so forth, or a lot of businesses, especially dairy, has been extremely hard hit the last 4 or 5 years. And so can this farm continue on with Junior with Scott at a 73% debt to asset ratio, and he's got payments to his other brothers and sisters for $21,500 a year for 30 years? Does that work? Probably not. Is it equal? Yes, it's equal. Okay, let's compare that to maybe a different strategy that we don't treat everybody equal. But is this equitable? We do the same things with the cash. We divide that up equally. We do the same thing with the non-farm assets. We divide that up equally amongst the non-farming heirs. And this time we have where Scott, the farmer, he doesn't get all of this for free, but he gets it for $950,000. He basically takes $900,000 off of it, and that $900,000 is split up 3 ways, same issues, except that now it's a $300,000 to each of the other brothers and sisters. They still get their $50,000 cash up front, and then they get a $300,000 debt instrument. Scott is in a 49% debt to asset ratio now. That's a little more manageable maybe. And the next 30 years, he makes payments of $14,333 versus the $21,500 he had before. And of course, this just illustrates the difference in how you can make this all possibly work for the non-farming heirs. Of course, this same situation could be used instead of part of the final estate plan. It can be used earlier in life in terms of ways to buy out for Scott to get involved in the farm earlier versus waiting for it all to happen here at the estate time. So let's think about your farm business, okay? we're doing a lot of talking here, and one of our goals is for you to be able to visualize how this might work on your farm. And when I'm with an audience, I ask people, what are their assets, those kinds of things. And, there's the land, there's machinery, there's buildings, there's inventory of crops and livestock and market livestock, fruit operations and so forth. Fruit operation, you're going to have perennial plants, you're going to have fruit trees, you're going to have some bushes, blueberry or fruit trees, or those kinds of things, raspberries, all kinds of stuff. If you're a livestock operation, you might have breeding livestock. If you got cows on a beef or a dairy or operation, sows on a hog farm. So you think about your business from the physical assets. We want to divide these things up. We draw a circle around this. That's the farm as a whole, but then we start driving some lines and separate these things out and try to treat them separately versus trying to treat them as all one big asset of the farm. Gives us lots of flexibility. Keyword we've talked about, we'll talk about a little bit more in terms of how to move this stuff around. So we kind of divide it up. There's also a thing called goodwill, especially on if you got a roadside stand, if you're an insurance agent, you got a goodwill that's your customer list, that's an established business where people want to come there, those kinds of things. So that's the existing green parent business. And we want to move these assets. We want to start a new business of some kind. This could be a 50-50 LLC, a 50-50 partnership type concept with the parents and the younger generation. That new business could be all the younger generation only. It can be a joint venture. It can be a partnership or an LLC with the younger parents and the junior parents. Lots of flexibility here. So what do we do? How do we make this all work? Well, the land, does the younger generation have money to buy this land? There's no way they can afford it in most situations. And so we just do a straight cash rent. That cash rent can be whatever you want it to be. There's no laws that says this cash rent must be X number of dollars. So that's the first thing. Because this operating business needs these assets that the green dot has. And so how does the red dot obtain ownership and control of those assets so they can use those assets to generate dollars and hopefully have a successful business? What do we do with buildings? Well, buildings are sitting on the land, so we just use a straight cash rent to start out. What about the machinery? Well, the machinery, we use our rent to own concept. We basically say, okay, this machinery, I got $100,000 worth of machinery. What if I say I'll rent it to you for $10,000 a year? And if you want to trade in some machinery, I'll give that to you. It's a gift. Think back on those different ways you transfer assets between families or between anybody. Doesn't matter. But it's kind of a rent to own. This rent can be a fair rent. It can be a soft rent, less than fair market value. What I mean by a soft rent. But it's a rent to own eventually. And it's beyond the scope to get all the legal details how to make that work. But I've done this for numerous years. I've had to talk to CPAs and how it works. And I'm certainly not a CPA. I don't pretend to be, but I have done this for many, many years, and it does work. Breeding livestock, that's a beautiful asset. From an income tax standpoint, it's a capital investment. It's a long-term capital gains on the sale. We can use an installment sale for the younger generation, the new operating business to buy those assets. It spreads the gain out over the time as the payments are made. It works really, really nice. Plus the long-term gains is not ordinary income for the senior generation. The junior generation has the expense on Schedule F of interest and depreciation for buying those assets, but the senior generation has long-term capital gains, a much more favorable tax rate than what ordinary Schedule F income is. Fruit trees, starting out is the cash rent. Fruit trees are complicated because they need to be replaced. And you got to kind of work it out and figure out values. How valuable is the planting, the block? Is it about run out? Who's going to put in the new block? Who's going to bear the cost of that? There needs to be some very good understanding, some written documents in terms of how that's going to work, who's going to pay for it, what happens when and if some reason this business is dissolved, what equities do people have and established in those perennial plants, blueberry bushes or fruit trees that they may be establishing on whose ground and so forth. That's a tough one. You got to work it through. Inventory of crops. We sell it to the new business, and it may be a gift. You can be any dollar amount. We'll talk about that. If it sell it to the new business, what does that accomplish? It's a lot of income into the new business. I'm sorry, it gets a lot of income to the old business, the parent generation, but you got to think a little bit. What happens if the younger generation doesn't pay its bill? Not everybody pays its bill on time. Very common. So then the younger generation does not have an expense. The senior generation does not have an income, and they can spread that out over 4 or 5 years. The younger generation replaces that inventory, replaces that corn crop over time. And if everything goes well, if there's enough money to go around for everybody, sometimes that inventory ends up being a gift, and that unpaid bill just gets kind of forgotten about. But there's all kinds of flexibility and tools that can be used here to achieve that. And of course, why is the operating business red? Because if it pays fair rent and full market value for all this stuff, it's like a naked business starting out. This business does not have anything as far as contributed capital. It starts out naked is the term I use. CPAs, they want to create this new business, and they have the parent generation put in contributed assets, and they own 90% of the business. And junior business doesn't have anything to put into it, maybe 5% the most, or even 2%. And so now all of a sudden you've got a new operating business that's 98% owned by the senior generation. What good does that do? Okay, not very much to help in the transition of working assets to the junior generation. And I can get pretty fired up on that in terms of my biases, in terms of how to make that work a long term, more than just the physical assets, but to get some real ownership and then pride of ownership into that younger generation. That's an important part of this in the process, and to make them a significant part of it. I try to make the parents and junior generation equal partners, equal business, shared in profits and decision making and responsibilities within that business. But what's reality? Reality is who's in control. Control is an important point a lot of people talk about. What happens if the red dot doesn't make its rent payments? Who's in control? Well, it's the green dot. Okay, the green dot, the parents, they're in the driver's seat. There's a lot of trust and understanding that has to happen between folks in order to make this thing work and how it does work. I've done this numerous times, the same structure with numerous different farms over the last 30 years. We talk about these assets. All I've done so far is to get the top assets. Those are all inventory, all personal assets. We've not done anything to actually transfer the lower assets. And that's where estate plans often come into the situation to help complement this transition process. We sometimes have to divide things up in terms of the farming heirs, the non-farming heirs. And we have some land maybe needs to go to the non-farming heirs because of the size of the estate. It's just too much to bite off for the younger generation and make all the pieces fit together. We have some of the land and buildings, the critical assets to the farming operation go to the farming heirs, the buildings, of course. And then we have some established relationships between the non-farming heirs and the non-farming heirs. It can be some long-term rental, maybe even some purchase agreements between these entities. We may have some of these options to buy between the operating business and the farming heirs and those kinds of things within the whole picture. Trees and fruit operations, those are just a pain because of the nature of the assets, but you kind of use a combination of things in terms of some sales, some rent, some use for free, depending on the incomes and all those kinds of things. There's a lot of flexibility in there, but there also needs to be lots of communication to help folks to kind of make it work. Okay, let's look at an example. I talk about you want to have that younger generation own at least 50% of that operating business. And so suppose we did an example here, and we have a 2020 value. We got $4 million worth of assets made up of inventory, machinery, some cow-calf operation, some buildings, and some land. And so we take these assets. What's this thing look like 10 years from now? We have a 10-year agreement. We go back to this process up here to move these assets from the parent business over here. It's a 10-year process to make that happen because of the time constraints, to spread the income out over time. For the operating business to generate enough income to buy these assets, it takes about 10 years. This stage right here is 10. I've had some around 15 years just because of the cash flows to make it all work. So suppose we did that. We have this 50% ownership in these assets. We move them from the parent business into this 50/50 LLC. The inventory stays the same. Say it's the same machinery. Say it cuts in half, 5% a year. So it's only worth $300,000 into the year. The cow-calf pairs, where they stay about the same, $1,000 a cow-calf unit. Buildings, maybe they drop to 75% of value. The farmland probably increases. I've got a modest 2% a year or 120% over a 10-year period. So it goes from 2.4 to 2.8 million dollars. And so now what does the LLC own and what does the parents own? Remember, the parents are half of this LLC. So we kind of jump over and we make another column. So this 3.8 comes over here. This 900 comes over here. Who owns the LLC? It's 50/50 between the parents and between the junior generation. Now, I'm assuming that the business didn't gain equity, hope that it did. I'm just trying to illustrate what happened to the original assets that were back here in 2020. Well, the parents' assets end up being 3.6 because they own half of the LLC and they still own all these real estate assets. Well, they're worth 3.6 million. The junior generation, they're 450, half of the LLC. What percent of ownership got transferred? Even with a 50% ownership in this operating business, 89% after 10 years is still owned by the senior generation. And of course, I hope that the equity, there's some equity gained in the LLC, but that all depends on how successful this LLC is. And the LLC with the junior generation is a significant part of those operations. So he or she is going to be very interested in making sure that this all works and goes together. So that's just to illustrate that point.
Well, that really gives us a lot to think about in the way of transferring physical assets. But how about what some of other people would call the softer skills, the transfer of management?
Right, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about here now is transferring management. So Roger did an excellent job talking about how we transfer assets, and I really appreciated, Roger, how you talked about started with the estate plan, and that can be pretty complicated, but then how many more tools you have available to you if you start doing it now. And it goes back to us really pushing for, let's start this process sooner than later. It takes us 10 years to get 11% over with a 50/50 business, but at least we're making some progress. And depending on how much time we have, we get more aggressive with that kind of a plan. Well, if we do that transfer before the estate, before death, that's when we really have an opportunity as well to transfer management. Hopefully that's coming along with those assets. And the junior generation is beginning to understand management leadership on the farm. Again, it's going to take communication, understanding vision and goals, understanding the differences in our life stages and in retirement. But what we're really getting at with this management, if you think back to that why businesses fail, that second number was 25% was that we didn't prepare the next generation to take over the business. And so that's what we're going to cover just here briefly. Well, first of all, think about how decisions are made, and that's going to vary depending on the farm that you're on. So some might be, one person's making all those decisions now. So how do we bring in the next generation in that kind of a scenario? Well, maybe we give them an enterprise, as Roger talked about earlier, where they're in charge and they make the decisions wholly for that enterprise. They get the final say. because that's kind of the way this business works. But maybe there's another business where we can have an equal voice and we can make decisions together. And that's great if that can happen. Maybe there's hey, I'll son, your daughter, you're 22. I'll let you have some management decisions, but maybe I don't want you making a decision over $10,000 in the first year. So maybe there's some limitations that you put on that, but the idea is start to transfer that decision-making process, give them a chance to start to learn management. Management's a huge area. It's easy to say, well, we got to transfer management, but this is I've seen charts that break it down a lot more than this, Roger, even beyond the 5 or 6 areas. But there's a lot of areas for a new manager to understand. And quite frankly, as a senior generation, we've done it for so long that we don't think about all these pieces anymore, and the functions of management, and then all the areas that impacts on the farm. So let's talk about those 5 that were on the bottom of that chart. 5 areas of management. Look at all the things that happen under each one of these. On finances, we're doing bookkeeping, we're understanding income tax, we're doing analysis. If we're talking about leadership as well, we're saying, okay, what do we do with that analysis? Where's this farm headed in the future? And really learning those skills and bringing along the rest of the farm operation. Making loan requests, on enterprise analysis. All these are areas for finance. Personnel, boy, that gets easily given to the second generation with very little training usually. Hey, Jane, why don't you take care of employee management now that you're in the farm operation? But there's a lot of things that go with personnel besides training and motivating employees. It's all that overhead HR stuff that we have to do in the hiring. It's learning to be a good communicator, figuring out what the structure needs to be for reporting, giving evaluation, giving feedback. Hey, you got to talk to landlords too that you're renting from as well in this area. The marketing area is a huge area. I've attended lots of marketing classes. I know Roger's got a lot of this down with him being doing some farming as well, having some practical experience. But boy, this can be a snowball really quick.
Boy, those things can be real learning experiences, let me tell you.
Yeah. And when you have, you learn by the negative stuff too, right, Roger? So, so giving them that experience, while you're around to share with them, learn how you do it, learn some better ways of doing it, learning areas that this younger generation can take on maybe sooner than other areas as well. And there's whole areas of information. Boy, this has changed immensely over our lifetimes. If you're in the senior generation here, the amount of data that we're managing now, and expecting owners and managers to be able to understand and learn is a whole other area of management. And then the final one, we often think of this as the fun thing because we get out in the tractor and forget everything else and start driving and disc or plant or harvest. But there's a huge amount that goes into this as well for that younger generation to learn. And so what we really want to encourage you in all of these is to really, understand the complexity, first of all, of management, remember how complex this is, and then start to help that younger generation begin to, understand these areas of management, allow them to walk beside you, learn from you, so that your business has a better chance of success. But because truly farm succession is only going to be successful if you do both the asset transfer as well as the management transfer well.
Staying on those areas of management, we're running short on time, but one of the things that I've done I think is successful, you make up a list kind of like we got here and have people write down areas, and then have the senior generation write down, these are areas that I think junior can improve upon. Okay, I think this is a critical area, and I think he's a little weak in this area, or maybe majorly weak. And you have the same list and the same concept by the junior generation. Have them write down, here's what I think I'm weak in, here's what I think I'm strong in. And then compare those two. Holy cow, you'll be surprised how common those numbers actually are. People agree that I'm weak in marketing, I'm weak in personnel management, whatever those areas are. And so that becomes then a focus point and a way in which people can work together and then develop a strategy for that younger generation to pick up some of those skills while mom and dad are still around.
Right.
Help them avoid some big mistakes.
That's the important part. I think the other important exercise is to sit down at that same time and say, okay, here's some of the roles as the senior generation that I'm willing to give up. And I'm going to hand to you. I'm going to stop talking about giving it up. I'm going to actually give it up and let you start to do that. We're back to you, Roger.
Okay. Flexibility. If we think about, I'm not there yet, am I? I've got to go from current slide like this. Okay, is that working now? Okay, flexibility. You know, what do you mean by flexibility? We need to have a plan that can make changes as things might happen. Maybe economic goals aren't met. There's a disability, a death, a business enterprise change, falling out between family members. Markets have changed, those kinds of things, consumer preferences. What fruit are you going to grow? Are you still going to grow a Michigan Delicious apple? How valuable is that? Not very well. So anyway, so there's all kinds of things that can happen. We need to have flexibility. Depends on what happens.
Roger, you need to share your screen. I think mine was locking you up still, so I had to stop sharing.
So I'm not sharing right now. Oh boy. So I've got to go here, share screen. I want to share screen too. I want to share it. And then I got to go back to here from the current slide. Is it showing now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. I think we're supposed to be at a question here, but that's okay. I guess an example when you're on the flexibility part is when you're discussing all these kinds of things and setting it up, you got to have some give and take as you work in terms of thinking about business structures and plans and what's going to be paid to who and those family budgets we talked about. All those things, there needs to be some flexibility up front as well as the plan being flexible once it's kind of put together. Of course, we're trying to simultaneously achieve all these goals simultaneously, and that's very difficult to do. How do you achieve an appropriate balance? Thinking about goal number 2, which is family harmony, those type of things, trying to keep this system so it's relatively flexible. An example of flexibility is maybe we have this machinery rent for 10 years with the junior generation and the parents. And after 10 years, that machinery kind of gets all transferred over to the younger generation. And all of a sudden, mom and dad, gosh, they don't have as much money to spend anymore. Okay, well, then maybe we need to bump the rent up on the land to a more fair, equal, or more equitable or more fair number, if you will, of what the market holds. Or maybe we start doing some sales, some soft sales or some sales that fit for everybody, that work for everybody when that time comes up. Again, that green dot, green senior business, senior partners, senior members have a lot of assets and control in this whole picture. Want to keep it simple as well. This is very complex. There's lots of stuff that's hard to understand. It's difficult to put all this stuff together. And that's why it takes the human mind to process all this and try to come up with some kind of a balance of these goals. So it needs to be, depends on the situations. It's a relative term of what simple is. People need to understand how it all works. If they can't understand it, how do you manage it, those type of things. There's lots of variables within it. What's the number of players? Are we talking about just 2 people? Is there, from a lot of times we're talking about a partnership that's the two parents. When they were kids, they did this 30 years ago or more. And so now we got businesses that are owned by 2 members of a partnership, and they've got different children, and maybe one's got a child that wants to come into the business and another one doesn't. And now all of a sudden we got a lot more complexities because the parent who has a farming heir, they're willing to make soft sales. The partner of the senior generation does not have family members into the business. Well, they're not quite so anxious to give some soft sales because they've got other kids that are not involved in the farm, and what's fair, what's equitable, all those kinds of things. And that gets really, really difficult to think that stuff through. What's the size of the business? What are the desires of people? What's the current business structure? Is it a C Corp? Is it an S Corp? What is it? I had a C Corp once that was a large farm. At one time, I think there were 9 families with no outside income that were living off of that farm back in the 70s and 80s. And of course, the economy went south and those things, but the farm was very profitable, had a lot of equity and the millions of dollars of equity. And we had, after all those families, 8, 9 families, were the parent generation, 3, 4 sons, and then their grandchildren or their sons and daughters were involved in the operation. And it kind of all fell apart because everybody could get along and it's all owned by this big C structure. And nobody could, even the house they lived in, they couldn't decide what color of paper to put on the bathroom wall because they didn't own it. Okay, and so people have some issues where they like to have some ownership. And, so that's my biases against a C corporation. But anyways, we'll talk about it.
Roger, do you need a team of professionals to help you decide on these things?
Yeah, it depends. We certainly need professional help. I think there's folks that help understand how this all puts together, not necessarily CPAs or attorneys, but you do want to have those folks involved. Sometimes they don't agree. There's different ways of doing this, and different people have different ways in which they want to do it. I remember one family that I worked with for quite a while, and grandma and grandpa had a small fruit operation, and they wanted to have the grandson become involved in the farm. And the parent of the son, the middle person, the middle generation, they had enough farm size on their own. They were farming separately from grandpa, his parents, and they worked together. They shared stuff back and together, but they were 2 separate sole proprietorships, kind of a modified sole proprietorship we talked about before. And the one grandson, he kind of wanted to take over and work on grandpa's farm. And so we worked it all out and what would work. And we had some soft sales in there. We had some opportunities for the younger generation to buy the farm assets at less than full fair market value. I put a deed restriction into it that he couldn't go off and sell it for big bucks. If he sold it for big bucks, he had to share with his other cousins and sisters in the whole situation. So that wasn't the intent, to give him a windfall. And we had the attorney in there, and I knew the attorney. I did not know the CPA. And we had us and the family all in a powwow, all sitting in an office room, and I started to lay this out. And then the CPA started to say, "This is how we're going to do this." And he says, "We're going to divide this thing equally." And I'm sitting in the back of my seat. I spent a lot of time with his family developing all these plans and thinking it all through. And he says, "Well, you can't do that." And I looked at the attorney, he looked at me, and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and kind of half laughed. And I says, "What do you mean you can't do it?" And he says, "Well, you can't do that." I says, "Why not? Is there a law about what grandma and grandpa can do with their assets? I think they do what the hell they want to." And he says, "Well, yeah, but you realize the problems I'm going to have as their CPA trying to convince those other kids that this is not going to be split equally down the middle for all of the children equally?" And I said, "Well, that's why we're here today." And I unloaded. I just lost it. I'm sorry, that here was a professional, a well-respected individual that was telling this family how they were going to do things. And it was not how they wanted to do it, but it was made it simple for him to do. Now it's what achieved the goals of the family. And that's kind of stuff just, we ended up leaving politely, and we ended up switching to a different CPA that understood what we wanted to do. As simple as that. He was done. He'd worked for this family for a long time. So, it's you just got to be careful on that. So the strategies and so forth are different. You need to make the decisions and then be able to live with those decisions. And it's tough. It's very difficult to make this happen.
Okay, so I'm going to launch our last poll. And we're just going to give a couple minutes to for people to answer. We're going to skip the break because we are very close to our closing time. We are probably going to go over 9 p.m. at this point, so I hope some of you can stick around. If not, we will send the recording and the slides via email in the next few days. So please just go ahead and vote. We're going to review those answers and we're just going to keep going. Also, if you have questions, we're planning to have a question and answer session at the end.
We'll stick around. We're going ahead.
And we will. But if you want to, give us a heads up of what your question may be, and you want to type it down, that might be helpful. We can also send written answers after the webinar if we happen to not be able to address your question. Frank, the gentleman that had asked a couple questions before, has left, so we do not have to answer those at this point.
Okay, it's interesting. Our results, I think we can share them, can we?
Okay, let's go ahead.
Yeah, overwhelmingly, you guys are talking. 70% of you that responded, and about 30 of you responded with it, and said that you guys are meeting occasionally. Another bigger, not having started yet, just getting started, and so that's the majority. Some of you are meeting weekly, so you're right into it. That was just one of the participants. 23, I guess, people responded to it. So very good.
We have somebody who had raised her hand. Joyce, I would suggest you type it down at this point. And in the meantime, we're going to keep going.
Great. So Roger, we're finally we're to taxes. Boy, this is what I hear the most. Just tell me how to make this happen so I don't have to pay a bunch of taxes and my kids don't have to pay a bunch of taxes.
That's the really very easy part. It's just simple math. Look at what happens under different strategies and so forth, and figure out the one that saves you the most on taxes, and that's the one you do. The problem is it ignores all those other 5 more important goals that you're trying to balance. Sure, you might save $10,000 on using this strategy versus another strategy, but if people are upset and they don't talk to each other for the rest of their lives, was $10,000 really worth it? I would say no. So there's a balancing act. Sure, it's important. Absolutely, it's important. That's why we're going to spend a little bit of time on it. And is it worth saving it? Of course, things change. We never know exactly what's going to happen. Those kinds of things.
What about, I hear about gift taxes and estate taxes. What can you tell us about those?
Well, there is a new estate tax law. It was back in 18. That goes through the 2025 year. And basically, it's we have $11,580,000 in the 2020 year for individual that we can pass as through the estate or through the gift tax exemption. Inflation is going to be $11,700,000 next year. We have estate tax portability. And so if you don't use it during your lifetime, your spouse can use it. And so then we end up with 23 million or 23.4 million next year. That's good through 25, versus back to 2017 law, which is basically, I think it's 5 million plus some inflation. The gift exemption amount per year is 15,000 in both the 19, and it'll be the same thing for 20. That's the annual exclusion. And so a husband and wife together can use each other's exemption, and so they can transfer $30,000 per year per giftee. Husband wife to husband and wife, they can move $60,000 before dipping into the lifetime exemption.
Isn't there Michigan? No, Michigan doesn't have an estate tax, do they?
Yeah, no, Michigan no longer has an estate tax, never had an estate tax since I've been alive. They did have a 2%, 4%, depends on the class of heirs, but for probably over 20 years now, we have not had a Michigan estate or an inheritance tax.
And also, Roger, I heard that they increased the annual gift to $15,000. So now I can gift up to $15,000 with our with the new law?
We don't have a question for this, do we? So basically, the question is it 10,000? Is it 15,000? A million? How much can you gift in 1 year? Is it 10 million? 100 million? It's unlimited? What is the right answer here? Well, the answer is it's 6. You can gift whatever you want to in any 1 year. So many people do not understand this. I go to estate planning webinars or sessions, and I'll have attorneys stand up and say this, that you can only give the $15,000 a year because that's what the annual exclusion is. People don't understand it is the problem. Okay, annual gifting and the lifetime gifting and the estate all work together. If you gift more than this annual exclusion, $15,000 per year, then you start dipping into and using up your lifetime exemption, which next year is $11,700,000 per person before there's any gift tax or estate tax to actually pay. So you can give $100 million away. If you did, you would use up your 11 million, use up your wife's 11 million, and so you'd have $75 million to pay this gift tax on. But it's a huge number, and you can. It's not this $15,000 that you hear people talk about how much you can give per year. Okay, and so it's a very important point. It becomes important when you think about large asset values of land, those kinds of things, and trying to make an estate plan work, a business succession plan work, to try to balance those goals of having a senior generation security and still providing opportunity for the next generation. A very important point that a lot of people just don't understand. Transfer taxes, it's a unified credit. Once you've exceeded your lifetime exemptions, that 11.4 million or 23.4 million together, it's a sliding scale, but basically above that, you're in a 40% bracket. So if you got more than 25 million, then you could have some estate taxes to pay, but then you start doing all kinds of stuff we used to back in the 80s when the exemption amount was only 600,000. And of course, 600,000, 40 years ago is a lot bigger than it is today. But still, the 22 million catches most of us in terms of those numbers. There's a 23.4 for the gift tax. So the question becomes, we've talked about a lot of things here. Okay, does this plan, these concepts we've talked about, does that allow you to look at these six goals that we have and provide a framework, a structure in which you can think about and try to optimize these 6 different goals simultaneously? Some take-home messages. Family relationships are important. Improved communication skills, recognize individual differences are important. Management participation, family decision-making, getting off the farm sometimes, have other hobbies or off-farm things are good to come back to the operation more enthused. Separate housing, we think is important. Living with your parents your whole life, you need to save money. Sometimes doesn't work. We've got a fifth agreement to the situation. Everybody is different. There's no perfect plan. That's one of the messages. There is no perfect plan. There's always something wrong with it. It's trade-offs. There is no perfect plan. Seek assistance. Have a team of folks to work with you on executing your plan. Write stuff down, document it, make it legal so it can happen, so people won't mess it up. It will take several years to materialize. That's step one, where we move the working assets, the inventory, and the crops. In machinery. That's a 10-year process for most folks. No guarantee on the outcome as far as that goes. There is one thing that I will guarantee. You got to keep working on it. It's going to happen one way or another, whether it's planned or unplanned. I guarantee it. Okay, something's going to happen. You're gonna become disabled. People are gonna walk away, or you're gonna die at some point in time. I haven't figured out a way to get away with that dying part. I'm not looking forward to it right away, but it's all going to happen to all of us. So we might as well plan while we're in sound mind get some stuff down, make it flexible so you're not locked in. Do parts of it, you can step into it, but please get started.
Okay, thank you, Roger. That brings us to the end of the presentation, and we have one question that is in the question and answer screen. I don't know if you guys have that open. It says, the monthly payments to the siblings would have to be from the farmer after taxes or before taxes?
Well, it depends on how the business is structured, okay? We're assuming in a business transition that younger generation participates in the financial results of how the business does. And the business owners, which would be the junior generation and the senior generation, if they are farming together in joint operation, they need to decide that together. It comes back to developing those budgets of what can the farm handle, what do you want to have happen, are you going to live well within your means, do a lot of things to make some sacrifices so that you can plow money back into the business, not have a brand new car every year, all those kinds of things, maybe not have the snowmobiles and the recreational facilities like all your friends have as a younger generation. It's awful hard to do because all your friends are off having fun doing this and so forth. And that becomes the family discussions, the things that Stan talked about, and the communications and expectations and a balance of those things. And so that part of your expenses have to be your income taxes, and income taxes have to be taken into consideration with your budgeting process. And so it's got to work, after the dust settles at the end of the year, after your taxes are paid. A lot of times we strategize hard, and especially with the flexibility part. Another part of flexibility is these rents that are being paid to mom and dad, the senior generation typically. That rent can be flexible, and it can get paid at different times, either held over for 1 year type things. If you have a bad year, if you have a good year, you can increase the rent. You can shift money back and forth between those entities to optimize the income tax part of it. Dan, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, it depends. Looking at the anonymous attendee's question there, it depends on whether that payment is. So Roger gave two examples. One where you're actually buying that land over time. You had an option to buy, and so that would be a different tax treatment because you're just paying a loan. You're not going to get deduction for that. Versus if he's renting the ground, if the farming heir is renting the ground still from the estate or from his siblings, obviously that is then tax deductible. So I think the main point is that's totally up to you as the farm, how you want to make that work in the future. We've seen some pretty interesting ways of handling land and ownership with non-farming heirs, and allowing them to still have a stake in the business, but they can't sell that stake at all. We heard that one recently. First time I had ever actually heard that, where a farm business was large enough and they had some non-farming heirs, and they all got a letter that said, hey, you own part of this business, but you can't sell it and you're not going to get paid anything for it. Mm-hmm. But what they got was an option to come back and be part of the farm. If their son or daughter wanted to be part of that farm, they had an option to come back into a business that was family owned. So it's a huge wide variation in what you might do between that farming heirs and non-farming heirs, and how those payments get made.
Thank you, Roger and Stan. I'm gonna now skip to Linda's question. Linda, you had also raised your hand, so I'm gonna assume that this is the reason why you raised your hand. At what point is an appraisal relevant?
Yeah, appraisals are sometimes relevant. One thing in the you want to do an appraisal when the senior generation passes away. One is to get a step up in basis from a tax standpoint, in terms of there's a windfall there, so all the assets get a step up in basis, which means that you can redepreciate those items or if land or whatever non-depreciable assets get sold, they're not exposed to income tax because you got a higher basis in it. I think the question may be more targeted toward trying to establish the value of these assets between generations. I quite often encourage to have an appraisal done. It depends upon the size and the dollars and other folks involved. That way we have a good, clean starting point. Here's what we agreed. The assets were worth, especially on that machinery at this point in time, what we're going to use for that. That one family that I started to talk about, we had each of the generations go through their list, just take their depreciation schedule, go down through it. What's that asset worth? What's that asset worth? And they each did it separately. And then I put it into an Excel spreadsheet and add them all together. And we're talking $1.5 million worth of machinery, and they weren't more than $20,000 apart on the total. Any of them, of the 5 people that did that, there was not that much difference. Yeah, they had some people had a lot higher, some people had a lot lower, but once they put them all together, they came up, and we just averaged them together, and that was the number that we used in terms of the value of the assets, in terms of trying to transfer that. There we actually created 3 new businesses. The younger generation couldn't get along, and they knew they couldn't get along. And so we broke it into 3 separate new businesses, 3 separate LLC, individual LLPs, sole proprietorships from that big corporate operation. And it involved grandma and grandpa's estates and all kinds of things. But an appraisal is important if people want to use a fair number and document. That's what it is. There's 2 reasons. One, for when you are setting the business up, what the rents are going to be. If it's a soft rent, then you know it's a soft rent because the asset's worth more than that. People kind of understand. The junior generation understands that mom and dad could have sold this for $1 million. If they're letting me rent it for $60,000 a year. So I'm getting a pretty good deal on this type things. If it's a large operation. So it does help in the understanding and the communication between them. Stan, would be my last comment on that.
Yep. Hey, Roger, the anonymous attendee was referring to your $14,333 per year payment to the siblings as to whether that would be tax deductible or not.
That payment, okay, yeah, well, the way it would be payment would be that he bought those assets from the estate. Okay, and so he paid money for those assets. He bought those assets, and so he will have the depreciation on those assets that he's paying for.
Yep.
If it was rent, not a transfer, then it'd be rent income, and there wouldn't be any depreciation. And so it just depends on how you jump through the hoops.
And I believe that was our last question for right now. So being 9:15 almost, do we have any final comments to make, Roger, Stan, or we're just going to thank people for coming and tell them goodbye?
Well, I hope that this inspires you to go forward and realize to reach out for maybe some resources and so forth, and don't give up on it. Keep working at it.
Yeah.
Some of the attendees were asking for our email addresses, which I provided to them via the chat, but they're also here, and I'm also going to make sure to add them to the follow-up email. And so you're welcome to email any of us at any time.
And I didn't catch Florencia, but mine has a T after the S, so it's more ST.
Oh, that's me bad. I did that. Sorry.
So lowercase m, and then I think it's lowercase c on Florencia's too. I don't know if that'll make a difference or not, but yeah, I appreciate all you guys being here. I'd like to encourage those on that last poll that said occasionally meeting to start scheduling those out, make them a regular occurrance.
Don't make them too long. Have a deadline when you stop.
Keep them short, have an agenda, keep note of your progress that you made, and wish you the best as you move forward.
Thank you, Laura. I'm not sure who you are referring to, but she's saying the moderator's time management was very good. So I don't know if it was great, but thank you for hanging in there. And Anonymous says, many thanks, well done. So thank you all. All right. Well, thank you for coming. I'm going to make sure to send that follow-up email. And again, email me, email Roger, email Stan, whenever you need.
We're going to send out a copy of the PowerPoints, right?
I will. I will.
Very good. Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. Stay in touch. Bye.
I assume this will go to Florencia's computer, Roger, when it's when we leave. Hopefully it doesn't try to go to mine.
Yeah.
Whoever it tries to go to will be on for a while. It'll download afterwards as well the next time we log on, but whoever it goes to, whoever's computer. So
Still recording. Pause recording.